So the other day I was asked to consult on a wildlife rehabilitation case, and I thought I would break down my thought process step by step to show how I solve complex problems. In my conversations with several staff working at this wildlife hospital, I realized that a decision that may only take me 10 minutes to figure out may not be as straightforward to other people. So I hope this is both interesting to people who aren't in wildlife rehabilitation that want to see just how much work can go into just solving a complex problem like this one, and for people who are wildlife rehabilitators to help them improve the standard of care for the animals that they take care of. Because wildlife rehabilitation tends to be so focused on the care aspect of rehabilitation, there isn't always as much thought put into the release side of things, which is just as important. If you released a healed animal into the wild during the wrong time of year and the wrong habitat, during unfavorable conditions, you might be setting that animal up for failure. And then what's the point of doing all that work if that animal is only going to survive 1 or 2 days after it's released? So I've broken my thought process down into a simple framework that I hope is easy to follow, easy to use, and will help people out there. And I think it's applicable to any animal, not just the one I'm talking about. So the framework that I'm using is not something that's specific to wildlife rehabilitation, and in fact, it might be kind of familiar from your time in elementary school. I'm not sure how they refer to this today. For me, they referred to it as the 5 W's and an H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. I think that this framework can work for other questions in rehab, not necessarily just release, because it's so adaptable. So the who in this case is going to be the patient in question. And if you've seen the thumbnail for this video, it's for a Virginia rail. Then number 2, or what, is what's happening to the Virginia rail. In other words, what's the question that we're asking? In this particular case, the question is when and where should we release this Virginia rail? For the sake of easily collecting all the information that we need, I've made a spreadsheet, and this spreadsheet is going to act as our cheat sheet for making this decision. So in the first row, we're putting our who, what, when, where, why, how. And in the second one, what we're doing is we're putting the easiest, most bare bones answer to that question possible. Those basic questions are going to guide us in making our decision. So who, Virginia rail, or what is where should this bird be released? And in this case, this is a migration question. When does it migrate? Where does it migrate to? Why does this bird migrate? And how does it migrate? And for the majority of this video, I'm not going to be talking about any legal requirements. So thankfully, there's a lot of resources available for bird rehabilitation that aren't necessarily for rehabilitation, but we can use them as rehabbers. So I've pulled them up here in these tabs. We have allaboutbirds.org by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Birds of the World, predominantly run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, eBird, which is a project of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and Birdcast, which, what do you know, is a project by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The reason why I point that out is because if you're trying to find information on birds, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is kind of the gold standard. I'm not saying that you can't use other sources, and I think you should use other sources, but the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has the most recent information. They organize their information really well. They update it pretty frequently. I find that it strikes a really good balance between being very user-friendly, but also having a lot of depth of information. All About Birds, Birdcast, and eBird are all free to use. The Birds of the World, unfortunately, you have to have a paid subscription for, but if you're a student at a university, a lot of universities will have free access to it. There are some species profiles that are for free, and honestly, I think it's kind of a bargain and definitely worth paying for, especially if you're doing a lot of bird rehabilitation. For the first part of this and gathering our information, we're going to be using Birds of the World and allaboutbirds.org first. eBird and also maybe Birdcast might be able to give us some other information we might need, but we will cross that bridge as we get there. Before we start reading about Virginia rails, we need to fill out our spreadsheet first. We're going to flesh out a little bit more on what we're looking for each of the questions that we asked. So our who is a Virginia rail, but it's a specific Virginia rail. There's specific things about that bird that aren't going to be the case for all Virginia rails. Basically, we want to describe the patient. This includes the location of rescue, the age and sex of this bird, if we can tell, the reason why it was admitted to begin with. And again, there might be other stuff that's relevant for the question you're asking too, but the summary is things that are about that individual patient. The what in this case is what we want to know. With some other questions, it might be the where or the how that we're worried about. But our root question is, where should this bird be released? And we really can't answer this question unless we answer all the other questions we've asked first. For our when column, when does it migrate can be broken down into the time of day, the time of year, the time of month. Any kind of time consideration is going to go into that question. For the where question, we need to know, where is this bird headed to? What location is it? And not only what location is it, but what kind of habitat type is it going to? If we look at this map on where the Virginia rail lives, it's kind of all over the place. It's pretty easy to get that even if you take a state like Florida, the internal parts of the state are going to be really different than the coastal parts of the state. So the blue and purple colors on this map are showing us where this bird stays during the winter. There's probably a good reason as to why that bird is there to begin with. If we look at the East Coast and South, for example, it looks like this bird is predominantly found in coastal or marshy areas. So it's not just, hey, this bird goes to Texas, it's where in Texas does it go? For why, we want to know why this bird is migrating to begin with. Migration is really physically demanding, so why would this bird choose to migrate rather than stay put? That is one of the big trade-offs in ornithology. On one hand, birds that don't migrate don't have to use energy, time, and resources to migrate, but they might spend time in unfavorable conditions. On the other hand, even though migration is costly, maybe that energy is worth it because your winters are going to be easier. Or maybe you're just not going to flat out survive if you don't migrate. So we need to consider food, water, shelter, and space. Maybe it migrates because of food. Maybe it migrates because of water. We need to look at this bird's life history to try to explain why it migrates to begin with. And finally, how does it migrate? And here we're looking for what triggers them to migrate. So for a lot of birds, it's the photoperiod, which is basically a fancy term for the length of day. But that's not always the case for every single species. We're also looking at the body and what requirements are put on the body. So some birds that you're working with might have to make such a long migration journey that you need to make sure that they're really fat before you release them. They need that energy to make the long journeys that they're going to make. And also we need to think about how that bird moves. The wing shape of birds can actually tell you a lot about them. If people want to know more about this, I'll make another video going over it. But basically, not all wings are created equal. Some wings are really good for migration and others are not. Some birds' wings are just not meant to handle big migrations. Think of it this way. Chickens have wings and they can fly. But do you think a chicken can make a nonstop flight to South America? I don't think so. So we need to find information on the actual process of migration. So first we're going to search our species. Right here, we have a lot of basic information as well as a range map of where this bird occurs. But there's also information on where to find this bird, some interesting facts about our bird that might be relevant to the question at hand. Under ID info, there's photos and videos of the bird. The life history tab breaks down these categories into a bit more detail. And under the maps category, we even get some information about this bird's migration. I suggest looking at videos and pictures of the bird if there are any, because that'll also tell you about how it behaves in the wild. So watching this video of the bird foraging, we see that it's in shallow water. So even though this video is to help with identification, this is telling us a lot about this bird. So this bird is foraging in low water, and that's going to become relevant later on. So I took some time off camera to start filling out this chart. I wrote down information that I got from the Wildlife Center. And in this kind of red color is just information from All About Birds. Virginia rails occupy shallow freshwater wetlands with tall stands of cattails and rushes. They need areas with standing water, typically less than 6 inches deep, with a muddy bottom. They are most common in wetlands with 40 to 70% coverage of tall emergent vegetation mixed with open water, mud flats, an area with matted vegetation. Although they are more often found in shallow freshwater areas, they do use deeper wetlands and salt marshes. During the non-breeding season, Virginia rails use similar habitat but may venture into more open areas. Virginia rails eat beetles, snails, spiders, flies, small fish, slugs, and crayfish and frogs. In the winter, they eat aquatic invertebrates as well as plant material and seeds. They probe the surface of muddy and silty bottom wetlands for prey, typically at dawn and dusk. They are a resident to short distance migrant. As a group, rails have the highest ratio of leg muscles to flight muscles of any bird, which may explain their propensity to walk rather than fly. When they do fly between or within wetlands, their flight is weak and short. Sustained flight only occurs during migration. That's all the information that we got from allaboutbirds.com, so it's time to move on to birds of the world. Because, as you can see, we don't know anything about when this bird migrates. And birds of the world is a lot more in-depth, and we're going to be able to find more information there than we are on just All About Birds. What's nice about Birds of the World is it's written and curated by ornithologists, and it updates pretty frequently, especially for North American birds. For a lot of other areas in the world, we just don't know a lot about those birds, but the team at Cornell is working really hard to fill in those gaps. What's nice is on the side here, you have all of these different tabs that are also broken down into smaller tabs. So if you're looking for something specific, it's pretty easy to find. So if you don't have a lot of time to make this decision, I think that you can just select the areas that you need to read specifically for your bird. But if you do have time, I highly suggest reading the entire thing, and that's for 2 reasons. First, even though you're predominantly interested in, say, migration, there might be some information that's relevant about migration that might be in one of the other sections. So for instance, if you're looking at the diet of a bird, it might have a completely different diet between its breeding grounds, its migration period, and on its wintering grounds. And that's something that's really important to know that's not going to be in the migration section because it's about diet. The second reason why I recommend doing it is you're just going to learn a lot more about that bird. Even if you don't retain all of the information that's on this, nobody is going to be able to unless they're a rail biologist. Reading the entire thing is going to help you understand what this bird is all about. And you're going to make a better decision the more you know. For the sake of this video, I'm not going to go through each individual section and manually show you what I think is important. Although if people want to see that, I can do a video showing me doing that. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time off camera getting all the information that I think is relevant, and I'll be directly quoting from this article. So on your own time, if you want to see what I thought was important, you can read through the article yourself and then also see verbatim what I chose is important. So see you in a minute. All right, so I just finished reading the entire Birds of the World account, and I also had lunch, and it probably took me no more than 30 minutes to go through the entire thing. There were some sections that I admittedly skipped. We don't really need to know anything about the breeding characteristics of this bird, and same thing with molt. Molt isn't really super relevant for what we're going for, so I elected to just skip those entirely, which did make my reading time a little bit shorter. Just for full disclosure, I'm now going to read through all the information that I found on Birds of the World, just so we're all on the same page. Under the Who section, I've confirmed that there's no easy way to tell male from female in the field. I figured out what subspecies of rail this is just based on where we found it. Most of the time this isn't relevant at all, but given that this information was available to me early on in the article, I decided to put it there in case any of the literature that is referenced talked about specifically this is a subspecies thing. And the last thing that I found out is that the Virginia rail is likely closely related to the Ecuadorian rail, to the point that the two were formerly considered to be the same species. Although that's not super relevant for what we're doing today, if for whatever reason we didn't have a lot of information on our species, we could look at closely related species to get some other information. It's not going to be perfect, obviously, because they are different species, but if we're missing something really critical that we need to know, such as diet, right? We can look at things that are really closely related to this animal and be like, okay, we don't know what this bird eats, but we know what its close cousin eats, and more likely than not, it's probably going to be kind of similar. So none of that information ended up being relevant, but I think it was important to collect nonetheless. We did, however, learn something really important for the when section. In Ohio and Michigan, birds depart mid-September to the first week of October, but have recorded as late as 18 October. Birds may leave as late as November in the southern part of the breeding range. Birds leave non-breeding grounds by early April and arrive in southern breeding grounds in early April and northern breeding grounds by late April to mid-April. Can arrive as early as late March. So we have a little bit more information on the timing of migration, both in terms of fall migration, but also spring migration, because it might be possible that this bird needs to be overwintered. Under the where section, we also got some information as well. Within its range, the Virginia rail is restricted to isolated wetland areas, but can be locally abundant if habitat conditions are favorable. Non-breeding distribution frequently follows major drainage systems, water storage impoundments, irrigation districts, wet meadows, and irrigated hayfields. Environmental factors affecting non-breeding distribution include availability of freshwater marshes and warm, in Fahrenheit, that's 0 degrees, temperatures. Occasionally spends the non-breeding season in areas surrounded by warm springs and otherwise frozen marsh conditions. Under why, we found out that post-breeding, so fall migration, is variable and also influenced by weather conditions. Seasonal changes in movements and habitats occur, possibly in response to changes in food, availability, predation pressure, or competing species. Forages mainly in shallow water or on mudflats. Prefers unstable, moist, silty substrate. Diet includes slugs, snails, small fish, insect larvae, aquatic invertebrates, caterpillars, beetles, flies, earthworms, amphipods, crayfish, frogs, and small snakes. Also eats a variety of aquatic plants and seeds of emergent plants. The non-breeding season diet consists of invertebrates, a variety of aquatic plants, and seeds of emergent plants. Under how, vagrancy and generalist habitats allow it to exploit a highly ephemeral niche. So vagrancy basically means that this bird is pretty commonly showing up in places where it doesn't normally hang out. And ephemeral basically means fleeting or transitional. For habitat and migration, flooded annual grasses or forbs with shallow water under 10 centimeters for optimal foraging in the central U.S. Migrating birds require a variety of water depths, robust vegetative cover, and short-stemmed seed-producing plants. Optimal wetland habitats for migrants includes a diversity of plant species with annuals predominating. Migrating birds are thought to fly low during the night, singly, often following river courses or low-level land. Audubon observed birds thought to be migrating, flying below 1 meter, above rivers and level ground. Pre-breeding migrants are adversely affected by storms. Seldom flies except during migration. Flight muscles poorly developed. Flight involves rapid wing beats on short, rounded wings. It often drops to the ground abruptly and ungracefully after a short flight. Frequently collides with utility wires and television towers while flying low at night on migration. Frequently hit by vehicles, especially young birds, while crossing roads bisecting marshlands. I also decided to create an other column just to put information that I thought was relevant to know, but wasn't necessarily in one of these categories. The Virginia rail, often coexists with the sora in marshes throughout its range. Comparisons between these two rails are common and allow insights into evolutionary recent life history adaptations. Because it is difficult to observe and attracts little interest from hunters, the Virginia rail has been little studied. Detailed information on many aspects of its life history is still lacking. Captive birds are easy to maintain on a diet of hard-boiled egg yolks, meat dog food, vegetable dog food, and vitamins. Wild-caught birds would not eat dog food unless mixed with live invertebrates. So for the last piece of the puzzle, we're going to go to eBird. So from the eBird homepage, we're going to go to Explore, and we're going to look for Virginia rail. Then what we're going to do is click on Large Map. What this large map is going to do for us is to give us a more accurate understanding of how this bird moves than the Birds of the World entry. So the Birds of the World entry said that birds may leave as late as November in the southern part of its breeding range, but that's kind of vague. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set the data range to only include the last 10 years. The reason for that is mainly because of climate change. There are some records in eBird that are 100 years old or more. And from decade to decade, the world changes a lot. And the first thing we're going to do is set the date range to just include November. So that basically said that's kind of the latest time that the birds would depart. And we're going to click Set Date Range. So let's look at this and then also compare it to the range map that we saw in All About Birds. So comparing them side by side, this makes sense. So in this area that's yellow, which is for migration only, we can see that there are records of these birds in that same area. But this is just a general overview, so we want to look a little closer. So this little hand cursor is basically where this bird was found. And as you can see, this is a pretty urban area. There is a river relatively close by, which it might have been migrating along, given the information that we learned in the Birds of the World account. But if we zoom out and look at the entire area, we find that over the past 10 years in November, there has been only one sighting of a Virginia rail, and that was at the beginning of November. Now, I always recommend casting a wider net, so we're going to zoom out even more. So now Roanoke's down here, and we've gone a little bit farther north, and we have a sighting here on the 14th. We have a sighting here on the 8th. We have a number of sightings for the beginning of the month, but we do also have one for the 29th. That was this year. And actually, it looks like the majority of sightings that we're seeing were from this year, and I think that's important. Over here, we have several sightings on the 3rd, one on the 12th, one on the 19th, and let's go further south. If we look farther west, there's a sighting here, which is for about the end of the month in November. And centering ourselves on Roanoke again, if we go farther south, we have kind of a wide variety of dates, but the most of which seem to center around the middle of the month. Here's some from the end of the month. And again, a pretty wide distribution of dates through November. This is telling me a few things. First, there are rails that are moving through in November. Generally, it looks like the date centers around mid-November, but we did have a number of sightings that were pretty much at the end of November, and they were this year. The reason why that's relevant is because, in my opinion, this November was really, really warm, like abnormally warm. And so that would make sense then, right? Because we found here in the Birds of the World account that post-breeding migration is variable and often influenced by weather conditions. Seasonal changes in movements and habitats occur, possibly in response to changes in food availability, predation pressure, or competing species. Because it was so warm this year, it's likely that a lot of Virginia rails didn't migrate as early as they normally do because there really wasn't a reason to. Now, we're going to do the same thing, but look at December. So up here in Lexington, they did see Virginia rails around the 19th. So interestingly enough, it looks like these two people have recorded a Virginia rail existing on their property for some pretty consecutive years. Here's another one too. What's interesting is to pay attention to the name. Good Place Marsh. Old Farm Road Pond. So there are Virginia rails here, but it looks like the habitat must have been good for them to remain there. And that makes sense, they like marshy areas. The next closest sighting is down here. And man, do we have a pretty big distribution of dates here. If we zoom in here, we see there's a lot of wetlands. And we can also look at this on Google Maps, where we can look at the satellite view. And if we're lucky, we can go right here and look at what this habitat looks like. Walking around and looking around at the water, it looks like these ponds are probably pretty shallow. I think it makes sense for a rail to be here because there's a lot of area for it to forage. While I don't think it's the best habitat in the world, I think it makes sense to why there'd be a rail here. Let's zoom out to have a bigger picture. Comparing these maps again for December, we have a distribution that makes sense. Because some years some birds migrate so late, let's look at January. In January for the last 10 years, we kind of see the same thing. There's a sighting up here that's kind of near the same place the other ones were, and it's at a lake. Another thing to point out is if you see these little text bubbles, you can go here and you can see that they didn't see it, but they heard it. Just pointing out that you can do that because sometimes there's information there that's relevant or really important. Lo and behold, in January, this same location has rails. This is why I think it's really important to look at eBird data, not just range maps. This range map is not bad. In fact, I'd refer to it as pretty reliable. This is telling you where you're likely going to see rails year after year. But that doesn't mean that the species is limited to that. It's still possible to have rails overwintering here that isn't listed on this map. We're not going to use birdcast today, but I'm going to talk about it briefly. When we're seeing the biggest push of migratory birds, this website has some really important information, such as when you're going to see a big push in migration in your local area. As you can see here, though, it is inactive and it will resume next year. That's because even if rails are migrating, the majority of birds are not. And based on what we read on Birds of the World, the timing of migration can change radically from year to year, for this particular species at least. Let's also compare this information to some other birds. So soras are pretty similar to Virginia rails, and their distribution is pretty similar. And it's especially similar where this bird was located in Virginia. So I pulled the same eBird records for the sora in November, December, and January. And as you saw in this area after November, there's kind of a drop off in sightings. We don't really see any sora at all, except for on the coast here and over here where it looks like there's some water in North Carolina. Obviously, you are comparing two different species that are not the same thing, but we still see this pattern of there's a lot more birds moving through in November. In December, there's a lot less. And there's a lot less in January. But just because a bird will show up somewhere and stay the winter does not mean that that's normal. So we're going to look at a couple other species that migrates a lot farther. I chose rose-breasted grosbeaks just because they have a similar-ish distribution in their breeding range. And if we look at November, there are some sightings of this species, even though the majority of them are in Central America. When we change this to December, we see there's a lot less in North America. And locally, too, there's pretty much no sightings at all. There's even less in January, and that also kind of goes for the whole United States. But you'll see that this bird even has sightings in January as far north as Canada. But if we look at some of these sightings, this person has said that they've had this immature male around since January 2nd. This one is saying that this bird has been around for a bit. And if we look at this photo, this is a first-year male bird. It has the red breast coming in of a male, but it has the overall coloration of a female, which means that this is a younger male. And let me be clear here that vagrancy is not a flaw, it's a feature. Each individual bird is different, even if there's patterns to their movements. So, while the majority of rose-breasted grosbeaks go to the tropics for the winter, there are some, for whatever reason, outside their typical range. If you think about it evolutionarily, even though it doesn't really make sense to hang out that far north for the winter, we don't know for sure, but the majority of vagrant birds probably don't survive. But what if there was a really warm winter and that bird did survive? And what if there's problems where those birds winter? What if that habitat for that bird is disappearing? For birds with really small ranges, one natural disaster could wipe out the entire species. So while it is probably better to migrate because there's more food, it's warmer, the conditions are better, that doesn't always necessarily mean that it's always going to be that way. Down in Florida here, there's a lot more sightings, even though when you look at this range map, it just shows that Florida is a migration area. One of the kind of pull and tugs with a species is if you're going to be successful, you have to cast a wide net. It's really funny to use this term specifically for birds, but you kind of can't keep all of your eggs in one basket. The world is constantly changing. Even without humans influencing the environment, species are still trying to survive. And if you're doing the same thing over and over again, you're not going to be able to adapt when things change. It's the same thing for people too. There are some humans that want to travel. They want to do different things. And there's some humans that are really content just kind of doing the same thing over and over again in the same county that they've always lived in. As I'm editing this, I see the need to clarify what I mean a little bit more. The point I am trying to make here is that individual animals are individuals, even if there are common expectations for each species. Humans are like that too. Every person is a unique individual with their own preferences, abilities, and traits. Some humans fit the current accepted norm better than others, but that does not mean those that don't meet the norm aren't useful or helpful. A lot of the world-changing figures in history, for better or worse, were outliers, and their individual traits are what made them who they are. In nature, there are many strategies for ensuring your survival. A tiger and a tree are both equally successful at doing their specific roles. But over time, those roles can change as the world pressures individual organisms, and thus the collective species, to change. Philosophically speaking, life is a never-ending dance of organisms, all interacting and shifting together in the face of unseen challenges that come out better for it or fail trying. Being the norm generally guarantees an easier survival, because that strategy is what worked for your particular kind well in the past. But the present isn't static. Without having odd individuals, the whole group of you won't be able to adapt as easily. Oftentimes, success comes down to being the right kind of organism in the right place at the right time. Successful survival is often born not from simply being the best suited individual, but by accidental luck, unforeseen misfortune, and radical action in the face of tragedy. Without oddballs, your entire kind will be more likely to die out if you all approach challenges the exact same way. Even if those odd individuals are less valued by their peers at that current time, their lives come with severe challenges that most can't even imagine, and most don't ever reach their full possible potential. You still need those individuals in the long run. The failure of an organism to survive does not mean their life was useless to the world. The failure of an organism to survive still means it had an impact on the world. Organisms that do not survive become the source of life for the next lives. Holistically, nature requires all types to flourish. And from the perspective of a wildlife biologist, thinking of those individuals that don't fit the mold and seemingly fail as defective or useless or unfit for life is entirely the wrong approach.
Who knows, in thousands of years, it might be those birds that overwintered in Nova Scotia that end up saving the species. Pretty much every bird has range maps like this. Let's look at wood thrushes. This is the normal range for wood thrushes. Even in November, we still have birds up in Canada. Same thing for December. Even in January, we have some, although we have a lot less, in part because a lot of the times these vagrant birds don't survive. So that brings us back to the question of the rail. We don't know what the right answer is because there kind of is no right answer. It is impossible for us to choose something that we know is going to be 100% right, but that doesn't mean that we can't make educated guesses. So let's review everything. We know that this bird was found in an urban area with trauma. It was likely migrating along the Roanoke River and got injured in the process. The migration of this species is flexible. It's possible that migration happened later than usual because November was so warm. However, we did see a concentration of more birds moving through in November than we did in December, and we saw roughly the same numbers of birds between December and January, at least in our area. But a lot of those sightings in December and January were from birds that were staying there for the winter. Virginia rails can exist in a variety of habitats, but they need access to water, but the water can't be that deep, and they're the most common in wetlands that have tall vegetation that can cover them. Rails are cryptic birds in that they like to hide in vegetation. The reason why they migrate seems to be in relation to food, and they need access to water to forage, or at the very least, they need wetland plants that they can eat. You'll also notice that there's a pocket of their range where they're around the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes, being large, are not as likely to freeze, in part due to their size. That is also probably why they're able to survive in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of the waterways in this area are less likely to freeze, and there's good habitat for them there. This bird is a really poor, weak flyer that only really flies short distances and rarely flies outside migration. And it's also known to collide with buildings and other structures when it migrates at night. There's also a lot of information that we just don't know, and we won't know, because we're lacking research on this bird. But we do know that it's similar to the Sora, and while the Sora is smaller and doesn't have as north of a range as the rail has, we see overall the same patterns when we look at eBird data. They are coming through in November, but there's a pretty steep drop-off and less reliable sightings once it's December. So that's a lot of effort. Where does it leave us? Our original question was, where should this bird be released? We summarized a bunch of different information, and that has led us to another question. Was this bird migrating, or was it a vagrant planning on staying the winter? That's what's really going to decide the answer, right? Going back to the location of rescue, this is not good wetland habitat, and even if we zoom out pretty far, it doesn't look like there's a lot of wetland area at all. Yes, there's the Roanoke River, but that's not really a wetland. There are some wetlands over here, but we didn't see any sightings of rails from November to January in that area, so it's probably not a great place for them to be. It is possible that they're there and we just don't have data, which is one of the challenges of doing this. The birds could be present, we just don't know, but we can't make decisions on data we don't have. That is one of the challenges of working in this area, because you're only getting data that birders are submitting. And because in this area, while there are birders, there's not nearly as many as there, say, in Austin, Texas. We don't have as good of records as we could have. And that's okay. We just have to make the best decision that we can make. So, based on the location of rescue and the lack of suitable habitat for this bird, I think it's pretty safe to say that this bird was migrating. Although we don't know for sure, let's think about this bird. This bird was likely migrating when it was injured. I do not recommend releasing it where it was found. But where to release it is a tricky question because we don't know if it was a vagrant or a migrant, even though based on the information available to us, it was likely migrating. However, there are also laws involved on where you can and can't release animals. And so what might be the best thing for the bird might not be something that's actually legal to do, which is really unfortunate, but I get it. You have to have some kind of regulation on the books. So with that in mind, I've come up with 3 different solutions. I am not in charge of this decision. It is something that the staff at the organization is going to have to decide. Number 1 is to release this bird on the eastern part of Virginia where this bird is known to overwinter. Obviously, it still needs to be released in the right habitat, and you can't just release it anywhere in that area. But I think the biggest pro to this option is that there's the greatest chance the patient is going to survive post-release. The patient was already migrating anyway. Statistically speaking, if the bird was migrating, it's probably also not a vagrant. Remember, when we looked at 10 years worth of data, there were only a tiny handful of birds that were vagrants. For Virginia rails specifically, that is. And so, if it was likely he was migrating based on where he was found, and the majority of birds are not vagrants, it just makes sense to take him to the closest area where the rails are usually going. Also, looking at the range map, we know that Virginia rails are normally there year-round. That means the conditions are favorable for them. On the con side of this one, we have no way to tell where the patient was migrating to. Yes, it's possible that he was migrating to the eastern shore, but he also could have been migrating to coastal Texas. Again, we don't know enough about rails to say. The second con to this option is you'd have to contact DWR. Because you'd be releasing the bird not in the county it was rehabilitated in, or the county it was found, the permit conditions say that you need to get permission from DWR before you do this. And it's possible that they might not grant it to you. The third con is less about the animal itself and more about the logistics. It would be a long drive to do, it would be kind of a pain to do, and the cost of somebody driving there and or paying staff to do that would be expensive. That's part of the reason why I included 3 options. However, from where I sit, I think this is probably the best option. I 100% agree that there are arguments against doing this, and I'm also comfortable with the fact that this is the best I can do with the information I have. But ethically speaking, as a rehabber, we are required to do what's best for our patients, not for personal gain. In the Code of Ethics, we're supposed to be doing what's best for the environment. That includes what's best for the individual animal, but also what's best for the bigger picture. In the current permit conditions, there's nothing written there that would prevent this bird from making this journey. There are no disease or public health concerns like there are for rabies vectors. The second thing that you could do, if the eastern shore wasn't an option, would be to release the patient at a wetland area that consistently has rails that spend the winter. So a place that's not on the eastern shore, but it's where from eBird data that we know rails have spent the winter. And that's precisely why it's the second option. We know that rails have survived there before. And that's the first pro. We know that rails have survived there, at least for part of the winter there, before. It's also probably less of a drive, less of a pain, and a lower cost overall. And it's less bad than the third option. On the con side of things, vagrant birds are less likely to survive. This individual is going to be competing with other vagrant birds. These areas are still less favorable areas with less favorable conditions. So for example, the water is more likely to freeze here than it is on the eastern shore. Part of that is due to temperature differences. It's generally colder here in the mountains than it is on the shore. And although Virginia rails tend to be in freshwater environments, we also know that they do use salt marshes. Salt water has a lower freezing point than freshwater. So even if it's the same temperature between here and the eastern shore, if for whatever reason it needed to go into an area where water was open and available, there's less of a chance of everything freezing over on the eastern shore. Even though there's less of a cost, there's still a cost overall to doing this. At the very least, someone's going to have to drive the bird there. Also, the bird might not like where you put it, and it might try to migrate or leave that area anyway. And it being December and not November, there's a lot less of these birds moving around. Conditions are only going to get less and less favorable as winter goes on, and there's less and less food. And you're still going to have to get permission from DWR anyway, because of the fact that all of the areas that we saw where rails overwintered were not in Roanoke County. Which brings me to the third option. You release the bird in Roanoke County. The pro of this is you're just letting the animal do its thing. It's kind of its own fault for migrating so late anyway, and leading to this situation. There's less effort and less cost involved in this option. And you don't have to contact DWR. But the cons of that, if you're cutting corners just because it's easier, even though it's going to negatively impact the animal post-release, then what's the point of rehabbing it at all? You've already sank time, money, and effort into that animal. And now you're just going to be like, it doesn't matter much. And again, we've established that there's no known place in Roanoke County where rails are known to overwinter. It's still possible that they could overwinter, but Roanoke is a fairly birded area. If there were indeed rails that were spending the winter, you think we would know about it. The places that we've seen where they have overwintered are areas that are more rural. Again, anything is possible, but if the records are showing that they're not there, there's probably a reason why they're not there. And third, you're kind of displaying a lack of care about the patient. In a way, you're setting them up for failure. Just because something is the easy option doesn't mean it's the right option. Just in the same way, something that's difficult is sometimes worth doing. I know realistically, not all rehabbers have the ability to do stuff like this. In that case, you could probably coordinate with another facility to get that animal where it needs to go. And this is why I think the first option works. You can transfer that bird into the care of another rehabilitator because that rehabber is legally able to release that bird in appropriate habitat. Yeah, you're still going to have to get transport to take that animal somewhere, and taking that animal in transit is stressful for the animal, not for you. But I think that that makes the most sense. There's also kind of a fourth option too, and that would be to overwinter the bird. There's no transferring or talking to people involved. During the winter, you're not getting as many patients as you would be during the spring and summer, and so you would reliably have an animal to do social media stuff with. Since rails are not often admitted to the center, and also they rarely survive, it would make for some good education opportunities. And there's also no transport costs. Or at the very least, there'd be a lot less transport costs because you would definitely be able to release that bird in Roanoke County come spring migration. However, there's also cons to this too, and mainly for the bird. It would be stressful for the bird to keep it in captivity all winter. And because you'd have to be still changing its cage, giving it food, making sure that it's well, you're gonna have to be handling the bird one way or the other, and that means that there's an opportunity for injury. The bird could escape and it could injure itself. And even if it doesn't injure itself badly, it could still injure its feathers. And feathers are really important for the health of the bird. If it loses enough feathers, it's not going to be able to fly, it's not going to be able to insulate itself, and then you have another problem. Second, it's going to be more expensive to overwinter the bird because you're going to have to feed it. The staff at your facility are going to have to take care of that bird instead of doing other things. And thirdly, and this is something that we just don't know about, is how does being overwintered influence a bird? Especially if it's a first-year bird that's never successfully done migration. I don't know what the age of this bird is. It could be possible that it spending its first winter in captivity is going to change how it migrates for the rest of its life. It's possible that rehabbing is going to have no impact at all, but we don't know that. We don't know a lot of things about how rehab impacts animals. So it's possible that by overwintering it, you're setting up that animal for failure. Here's the thing. At the end of the day, this bird cannot be released back where it was found. This is not an okay area to return this rail to. I mean, maybe you can get away with releasing it along some parts of the Roanoke River, but you're still relocating it from its point of rescue anyway. Again, I can totally understand someone critiquing me and being like, you should never relocate animals ever. So some people argue that it's really critical to save one pocket of species rather than being like, it's fine, we can just release them in a similar habitat years down the line.
I generally agree against relocating animals for a number of reasons, regardless if you are talking about nuisance animals or rehab animals. Currently, there is a larger body of research against relocation than for relocation, for a number of different reasons. However, I do think that there are some instances where relocation is needed, either for conservation, for research so we can make better conservation decisions, or because the only other choice is extinction. Also, I think with flighted birds, especially bird species that are frequent repeat offenders of accidentally ending up in places where they shouldn't, like rails, there is a bit more nuance about what relocation means in the context of species that cross the continent twice a year. This is especially true because birds ending up in places they normally shouldn't is practically a daily occurrence, which you don't see in other organisms because of the unique biology and range of birds. While I wouldn't argue for relocating birds like Carolina wrens, which largely don't move around aside from local dispersal, I can argue that longer distance migratory birds should have a lot more wiggle room, especially in the case of the Virginia rail, where they generally only ever really occur in this part of the country, temporarily during migration. There are many valid concerns I don't discuss, such as disease risk from relocating, and the fact that relocating a young bird may also impact its ability to properly migrate in the future, just as keeping it in rehab might do. But rehabbers are often forced into tough ethical decisions. Often, we have to make decisions between two evils and try our very best to figure out which evil is lesser. As rehabbers, our scope is largely focused on individual patients first, and then the bigger environmental picture second, even though we need to weigh all our decisions we make between both of those options when making choices.
What made me lean towards the Eastern Shore option in the end was, 1, there was potential transport for this bird lined up. 2, this particular bird was very good at escaping confinement. Generally, this increases the injury risk for captive wildlife. And 3, the stress of being overwintered versus the ease of getting the bird back in the wild. In a country where 1 in 4 wild birds have disappeared from the landscape in just 50 years, in my eyes, trying to keep as many healthy, viable wild birds in the wild as possible is more important. Given the circumstances, a sooner release seemed like a better option to me.
So I would say at the end of the day, my suggestion for this rail is to transfer it to a rehabber on the Eastern Shore somewhere and get them to release it in habitat that's suitable for the rail. While I can understand the argument that relocating the animal is a bad idea, I also think that releasing it in Roanoke County is a really bad idea. And yeah, you could overwinter it. And if the option is we can't take it to the Eastern Shore, then I think that you should overwinter it instead. But I also think that transferring it could be a win-win-win because you're building a connection with another rehabilitator. They get to have the benefit of releasing a healthy animal because they can use it for social media and stuff like that. The patient is probably going to benefit the most from doing this. You're not going to have to ask DWR for permission because rehabbers transfer stuff all the time for this purpose. And yeah, there's cost involved because most likely your center is going to have to arrange transport to take that animal to that other rehabber. But I think that con outweighs all the pros. You could strike a deal with that other rehabber and say, hey, how about we split the costs here? We both can use this release for fundraising and social media purposes. If you're willing to chip in a little bit of gas money. Or maybe they have a transporter that can meet you closer so you don't have to drive all the way. I think that there's some good diplomacy here that again would kind of benefit everything. So I know that that's a lot and I know that it's really long, but hopefully this is a really good framework to follow for similar questions you have. I will tell you right now that the majority of rehabbers don't go through all of this effort that I just did, but if rehabbers are going to be taken seriously by wildlife biologists and other wildlife professionals, we need to up our game. And the more that you do this sort of thing, the faster you get at it. I don't know what the runtime for this video is going to be, but I have put probably around 7 or 8 hours of work just into getting all the information, setting this all up, and filming the video. That's not counting editing it. But if I didn't have to do all of that, and I was just responsible for coming up with an answer to this question I was asked, it took me like 30 minutes of my time. And part of that is just because doing this is second nature to me, because I've practiced doing this over and over and over again. But at most, doing this for yourself should only take around 2 hours max. Maybe a little bit more if you're a slow reader. Anyway, I know that's complicated and it's really long, but I wanted to show you every single step that goes into this. And I also tried to organize it in a way that made it easy to understand. And it's possible that someone would come up with a different answer. I think that's fine. I think you just need to be able to argue your answer and feel confident in it. I know that I don't know everything. I am aware that I don't know what's best for this bird, but I have done my best and I've done everything reasonably that I can in my power to come up with the best decision. The only thing that I might be able to do differently is ask a biologist that specializes in rails, but most likely they're not going to know the right answer to the question that I have because we don't know enough. My rule of thumb is if I think I can reasonably argue with a state biologist, I'm able to cite credible information and form an argument that I think that they could accept. And even if they bring up valid critiques, I feel like I can argue against most of those, then I feel like that's a good decision. It's the best decision I can make. Perfect is the enemy of good, right? It's never going to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. You get out the amount of effort you put in. And when you're dealing with lives, I think that matters. So I hope that that was helpful. I hope you learned a lot. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. And if you're a rehabber that has a question and would like to consult me, feel free to reach out. I really like doing this stuff. And the reason why I started this channel is because I wanted to help other people. Thanks for watching, and I hope that really helped.